podcast to help you find peace with food and overcome disordered eating. And I'm Harriet Frew, aka the Eating Disorder Therapist. And I'm so excited to share with you all kinds of stories, tips, information, and guest interviews to help you on your journey in finding peace with food. So thank you so much for listening today. Now, today I want to talk about some mindset shifts you need in eating disorder recovery. Okay, and I'm going to do this as a two-part episode. This is going to be the first one, and the second one is going to be released later this week, as I thought there was quite a lot to cover in all of this. So, with eating disorder recovery, in part, it is a psychological process. Yes, it's about food and physical healing too. So if you're undernourished, you need to eat more. Perhaps if you're stuck in the diet binge cycle, you might need support with regular eating, balancing blood sugar, etc. And it's also incredibly helpful to be neutralising foods, not banning or forbidding foods, hopefully moving closer to a more intuitive way of eating and self-trust with the body. So these behavioural changes will definitely provide you with such a solid platform for healing and are really a necessary part of the process. However, if you focus purely on behavioural change without working on your mindset, your self-worth, your emotional intelligence, your thoughts, your relationships, your perfectionism and more, you could be stuck in a very quasi-recovered place. So you might think, well, I'm eating the food, I'm doing the stuff, I'm meant to be feeling better, but I don't feel better. In fact, you might think I'm feeling worse. And I just want to say that sometimes in the recovery process, it's quite normal that you can feel worse before you feel better. That's completely normal because you're kind of taking away a coping strategy that has been protecting you from lots of different feelings and thoughts, etc. So immediately you're not going to have new ways of coping in place. So when all those feelings and thoughts come to the surface, when you're not numbing yourself through using food, restriction, binging, over-exercising, etc., it can be really, really, really hard. So just want to kind of acknowledge that. So people get stuck in this quasi-recovered place, and it can be hugely tempting then to kind of think, well, I've tried recovery, it hasn't really worked for me, so I might as well just kind of go back to the old way of coping. So if you recognise yourself here, you are really not alone. And I want to say to you, don't go back to the old way of coping. Eating disorder recovery is just more than focusing on food and establishing the regular eating, etc., although that is all an important part of the process. So I'm going to talk about some mindset psychological shifts that are needed for a full recovery. And this is just my opinion. Other therapists might share some of this perspective with me, but I guess it's just my own thoughts from working with people for many, many years. And I guess things I'm going to be talking about, it's not limited to just the things I'm talking about. I guess we could extensively look at all kinds of different areas related to mindset and the psychology of eating disorders. But these are just some of the key things that I think are particularly relevant. So it's important, I think, to flag as well that working on the psychological side of an eating disorder is not a quick fix. And you might need to see a therapist or a coach or someone who can guide and support you through this process. Okay, so I think that's just something that's really important to say, because I think sometimes people feel like, oh my goodness, I should somehow be able to sort all of this out on my own. And sometimes, if we've been through some quite difficult things, we do need that extra support, and that's completely okay. So let's get to it. I'm going to talk about 3 things in this episode today, and then 3 or 4 things in the next episode, but I'm going to see how it all pans out. Okay, so number 1. You can't just bury your past. Now, understanding your past and what led you to develop your eating disorder is challenging work, and particularly if you have been through some trauma. And I guess it's important to say as well that no one can push you to want to explore your past, and sometimes as well the timing needs to be right for it. If you're going through lots of transition and change and you're not in a very supportive environment, maybe now is not the time to do a deep dive into what is underneath your eating disorder. But I think what I find is that lots of people who come to see me have read all the Instagram posts. They're maybe starting to do more regular eating, they're starting to eat a few more forbidden foods, etc., but they haven't really explored what's underneath. And I get it, because it can be scary. And as humans, we tend to try and avoid our pain. We are very avoidant. We push it down, we numb it, we distract ourselves from it, we escape from it, and then it's like the kind of elephant in the room that doesn't go away. And what tends to happen is when we try to push our pain down, it leaks out in ways that can feel overwhelming and confusing. So you might relate to this. You might wonder why you cried for 3 hours solid in response to something that you felt was really just quite a minor incident. But when you really look at this situation, you realise that this grief was about something far deeper than, than this incident that just happened in the present. And I just think back to my time when I was living in London in my early 20s. I remember going into college. I was doing a master's at King's, and we had to do some kind of practical. And I wasn't great at practicals, to be honest with you. Was not my favourite thing. But I remember something happened during this practical, which was relatively minor, really. But I just burst into floods of tears and I just couldn't stop crying. And I remember all the tutors and people around me just being a bit kind of overwhelmed and kind of a bit shocked and thinking, where did all of this come from? And really, for me at that point, it was nothing to do with the practical. I mean, it might have been on the very surface level, but it was about all kinds of other things that were going on in my life. And I was still struggling with bulimia at that point. But, I didn't feel able to share that with some of those people at that time. It wasn't the safest of environment. But I guess that's just quite a good example of when, in a way, our kind of pain tends to kind of leak out in ways that we can't control if we keep pushing it down. Okay, and also sometimes then we can't control that and it feels a bit scary and overwhelming because it's always bubbling very close to the surface. So when you feel ready and with the right support, it's a vital part of your healing journey to start to look at what's beneath your eating disorder. So I guess we all have traumas, some that we call kind of more the large T traumas. Maybe if you've experienced, abuse, or you've been through something, really very kind of like a major loss or something that really has impacted you psychologically. Or it could be like the smaller T traumas. And I think it's not to minimise anyone's trauma, but sometimes it can be the drip impact of maybe not getting your needs met in your family over a long period of time. And it's not as though something terrible and awful happened on one day and you are constantly being reminded and taken back to that sort of terrible incident, but it's more like the drip impact of just perhaps, people not being available emotionally for you. Perhaps they were too busy, or they were looking after sick relatives, or sort of distracted or busy with work or financial worries. But the impact on you was that you didn't get your emotional needs met, and then you might call that more like a small T trauma. But I think at the end of the day, I don't want to kind of label anything as a small T or a big T. I think it's very much down to you and how you interpret your trauma that is important, rather than anyone else from the outside telling you how severe it was or not. And I think what's really important to recognise is that we've been raised by parents and grandparents who often have had very little understanding of mental health, due just to the old conditioning of society. Mental health back in the day was not taken seriously. There was so much shame and stigma. And obviously, we're still experiencing this today, but back in the day, mental health was just not talked about. So your parents and your grandparents were very likely not brought up in an environment, unless they were very fortunate, where they had their emotions validated, their self-worth built, and all the things that we know are needed for a human being to flourish. Now, this is not your parents' or grandparents' fault, because people can only do the best they can at the time with the resources they have. So it's very likely that even if you felt you were loved and you had all your physical needs met, you may not have had your emotional needs met fully. You may also have grown up in a household where people dieted or were very fat phobic. And again, unconsciously as well, of course, we've been influenced by the media, the wider culture. All these things impact us from very, very young. And, I think back in the day as well, we didn't really have much understanding of the long-term impact of all these things. So really important just to acknowledge this. And I think, with your parents and your grandparents, if they have done a lot of work on themselves, or they've had their own therapy, maybe they've been involved in therapy with you, they might have more insight and understanding and be much more emotionally attuned. So I don't want to just say no one of previous generations has understanding, but I think a lot of people have really fallen short in terms of their psychological awareness and understanding, just because society was not set up to acknowledge and value our mental well-being in the way that it is today. So when you're ready, it's an important part of your healing to begin to understand what has led you to the point that you're at today with your eating disorder. It's helpful to gently explore, again when you're ready, the different triggers and events that have impacted you growing up. And it's healthy to begin to explore and process your feelings and thoughts and memories all around your growing up in a safe space. So it's important that the timing is right for you to do this, that maybe you're not in a major transition or an unsupportive environment. I think no one should ever feel pushed to go to therapy when they are not ready, but it's something to really think about. It's an important part of the jigsaw puzzle in trying to kind of work on your healing. Because if you don't heal from your past, you're going to be unconsciously pushing down the unhealed trauma, the unhealed feelings, and these aren't going to go away. So you're going to be drawn to restriction or overexercise or binge eating or other maladaptive ways to help numb and distract you from the pain that is bubbling beneath the surface. And this will impact your daily life, okay? It will impact your relationships, your worth, and your ability to fulfill your full potential. Now, in my own experience, my core pain was linked to my early life and having to suppress a huge part of myself to keep the peace and take care of other people in my life. So the eating disorder for me was a distraction, a relief from the pain, and an escape from confronting the reality of things I didn't wish to confront. And in the healing process, it involved getting in touch with a lot of rage, upset, guilt, shame, and overwhelm. And it was messy and emotionally turbulent at times. And I felt I was never going to get out of that pit of feeling inadequate and not good enough. But I hung in there. And I think something in me knew deep down that there was more, okay? I wasn't on this earth to live my life with an eating disorder, to please my parents, to make myself small, to try to fit in. So it was hard, painful, emotionally discombobulating, can I ever say that word, to follow my own path. And I didn't have any idea how it was all going to work out. You know, I had this vague notion at age 23 that yes, I wanted to become a therapist, but I had no idea how that was going to work out, if it was going to be possible, if I was ever going to heal myself. You know, it was a kind of a step into the dark. But that self-investment into understanding myself and beginning the healing process in my 20s was invaluable. It was actually golden. And it's made my 30s and now my 40s so much easier, okay? I've been able to be a better parent. I've been able to do the job I do today. I've been able to navigate healthier relationships and higher levels of self-worth. Now, none of this would have been possible without working through the past and understanding how the pieces of the jigsaw all fitted together, okay? And I guess I'm still on that journey now. You know, I haven't engaged in sort of eating disorder or disordered eating behaviours for many, many years now, but I'm still working on the self-worth, the people-pleasing, some of the other factors, you know? It's a lifelong journey. Now, if now is not the right time for you to have therapy or coaching or to see a professional, you can begin to explore some of your thoughts, feelings and memories through journaling and self-reflection. You can begin to think about the things that have influenced your growing up and how you feel about yourself. You can gently notice the things that have impacted you. And even if you don't feel ready to explore some areas yet, you can acknowledge that you've been through some stuff and offer yourself some compassion and understanding around why you might be using an eating disorder to cope, okay? And that is a big step in beginning to form a different relationship with your eating disorder. And just to offer yourself some kindness and compassion, because I think when we're struggling with an eating disorder, we're so hard on ourselves. We feel that we're this kind of shameful, awful person that has this terrible relationship with food and body, and we feel so alone, so guilty, so wrong. But when you can actually start to recognise this is a coping strategy, we can start to have a different relationship, and that sometimes is the first point of change. Okay, time for a short advertisement break. Friends, does it seem like I'm okay until I'm stressed, then I can't stop eating? Am I ever going to stop binging? I can't slow down or relax. I can't tell my hunger and fullness even though I think I'm eating enough. I'm fine with food till something happens, and then I'm restricting emotional eating or not buying groceries again. I surround myself with body positive pictures, wearing more comfortable clothes, but I still can't stand my body and I fear gaining weight. You don't lack knowledge. You might just not have had and felt a sense of safety inside you for recovery efforts to fully land. This means you might be living in chronic fight, flight, freeze or please, and you need new experiences of the threat responses softening that cause the eating and body image issues in the first place so that recovery can actually stick. If you're seeking the missing piece in your food, weight and health recovery journey, consider trauma-informed nutritional counselling with Tracy Brown and Associates. Tracy can be reached at www.tracybrownrd.com/get-started. Link is in the show notes to learn how to shift what has been too much or not enough inside for food to feel easy. Okay, so I'm going to now move on to point 2 around mindset and psychology. And this is truly embracing your ambivalence about change and working on your motivation. Now, I don't think I've ever met anyone in the therapy room who has not had some conflict around change when it comes to their eating disorder. So part of you might be desperately wanting rid of the eating problem, and part of you is also incredibly fearful about letting the eating problem go. And this can be confusing, and you can feel torn in half, pulled in opposing directions. So a part of you might be completely fed up with the problem. It's preoccupying you, it's leaving you exhausted, it means you can't go out socially, your mood's all over the place, and basically it's robbing you of a fulfilling life. But whilst all of this may be 100% true, there's another part of you that is extremely apprehensive about letting it go. And this can be for a multitude of reasons, and many of these reasons are not obvious to begin with. And ultimately, it's because an eating disorder is a coping strategy. Now, this doesn't mean that it's a logical, thought out and planned strategy. It's much more likely to be an unconscious reaction to stresses and things going on in your life. You would never have planned or intended to be using food, controlling your weight in the way you are now. It's just kind of happened. Now, until you can be open and honest with yourself about how the eating disorder is actually serving you or helping you cope, only then can you begin to question this with curiosity and compassion, and to think about alternative and more helpful ways of solving these problems without using food. Okay, so one of the very common ways that people try and cope with using an eating disorder is trying to get some numbing and distracting from difficult feelings. So obviously, if we go on a diet, if we restrict, we cut out a food group, we count calories, we weigh our food, we follow a brand new plan, we do loads of steps, etc., etc. Essentially, you're giving your brain something to focus on in a very intense way. And, once you start going down that road, you can't really help but not be preoccupied with food. Because when you're in a restrictive phase anyway, your brain will be demanding glucose, it will make you think about food. And this is a physiological survival mechanism that you can't really override. But once you start focusing on food or weight or body image or how many steps you've taken, your thoughts and feelings become very directed around these behaviours. So what basically you become in this almost like kind of tunnel of food, body, diet, restrict, exercise thoughts. And what this does is it means that you're going to stop caring much less about other things going on around you. So, for example, a friend not responding to a text, or if you have an argument with your mum, is going to matter much less significantly as increasingly you're directing your energy towards food and body thoughts. So it almost kind of gives you this kind of protection. I think, again, this isn't really a conscious thing. Now, often an eating disorder or disordered eating is triggered from an outside external source. So it might be a relationship breakup, it might be a bereavement, it might be some kind of trauma or experiencing bullying or exam stress. Now, in our culture, it's so easy to project our negative thoughts and feelings onto the body. So rather than feel the rejection, the sadness, the anxiety, the guilt, the pain, perhaps, when we were exposed to that external triggering event that was very painful, perhaps there was no safe place or person to talk to about how you really felt. Maybe you had to be the strong one. Maybe you had to kind of look after everyone around you. Maybe if you had sort of expressed your grief or upset or anger or whatever, it just wouldn't have felt safe and you wouldn't have been met with acceptance and understanding. So using food as a focus is an understandable survival strategy to help you through. And maybe food was the only solace and comfort at a very difficult time. And maybe focusing on counting calories blocked out the pain so you didn't have to feel it. Now, by turning to food or exercise or whatever it is, it's often not a conscious process. And you might be listening to this and think, well, I don't even know what's underneath the eating problem, because maybe you become so preoccupied and focused with the thoughts and feelings generated around the symptoms that you just have no clue. For example, maybe you're feeling so guilty for eating that extra biscuit or biscuits, or anxious about being weighed or a weigh-in you did with yourself this morning. So your head is buzzing with disordered eating thoughts. So you're not even really accessing the deeper pain that is underneath. So if you recognise yourself here, offer yourself deep compassion and understanding. It's a powerful step forward to understand your eating disorder in this new way. And it's the starting point of change. And you can really start to have a different relationship with your eating disorder when you start to view it more through this lens as a coping strategy. Now, I appreciate that beginning to access the underlying emotions can be a daunting and scary prospect. And it might also be hard to see the wood for the trees as the symptoms have become so entrenched and genuinely stressful. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking, I would like to try and get a bit more access to what's underneath, you might need to get your symptoms a bit more under control first. So that might include, if you're underweight, you might need to do some weight restoration. If you're sort of not underweight, but you're in very disordered eating cycles, you may need to reduce your frequency of binge eating or purging or chewing or spitting or over-exercising or whatever it is you're doing, so you can start to have a bit more sort of stability with your physiology, so you're able to engage in a more resilient way with your emotions. Because I think for the best will in the world as human beings, if our physiology is all over the place and we're tired and we're just feeling rubbish, our emotional resilience is very, very low, and that's completely understandable. So once the fog begins to clear, you can begin to touch base a bit more with those underlying feelings. And it can be painful work, and sometimes the best place to do this is in the safety of therapy. But I think not always, okay? But I think, you might have a sense yourself if you feel that you would need to do this in the safety of a secure relationship and the containment of therapy. Or you may have someone in your life that you can talk to, or you may feel able to start exploring some of this yourself. There is no right or wrong way to engage with this. Now, in my own recovery, my core pain was about not feeling good enough deep down and deep feelings of unworthiness. It was feeling that I was really unacceptable and as I pleased others, and there was a deep sense of shame about who I was as a person. So I had internalized a lot of messages that had been sort of put onto me that weren't really mine to hold, when I look back in hindsight. Because I had heard these messages again and again, I couldn't shake them off. They felt true to the core, they felt that these were true facts about me. And I coped by trying to be everything to everyone, being whoever the person needed me to be in the moment, and not even knowing that I was doing this really. It was an underlying survival strategy to protect myself from potential rejection and to try and feel safe. So for me, the eating disorder was a way to deal with conflicting feelings that I couldn't allow myself to feel in an open and honest or direct way, okay? Because if I tried to access those feelings, I would feel so much guilt and shame and overwhelm that I felt I just could not have these feelings. So restriction and control of food and weight felt good and pure and right. Binging and purging felt disgusting, wrong, bad, and a way for me to express all my rage, upset, anger and guilt that I felt in some of my relationships, but I felt I had no permission or acceptance to share. So it was a survival mechanism when I was living at home, but then I took this unhealthy coping strategy out with me into the real world, where it was still no longer helpful, although it felt right. It was a difficult old cycle to break. But starting to really recognise how the eating disorder was helping me cope was a real turning point. Okay, so another coping strategy that is often very linked up with an eating disorder is a way to find a sense of purpose and achievement. Now, diet culture is powerful, relentless with its messages. You know, we have all the messages. It's really good to be thin, to control your weight, to shrink your body to smaller proportions. And sadly, so sadly, this is celebrated as some kind of feat or achievement, almost like a golden trophy of honour that sets you aside from others. Thin is idealised and objectified and put on the pedestal of worthiness. And this is just so toxic. I mean, I think we are making some progress as a society with sort of body positivity, body neutrality, celebration of sort of diverse bodies, etc. Things have moved on from the 1990s, the 2000s, but we are still a long way off. Now, of course, when we pursue this thinness or leanness or whatever it is, it doesn't work deep down. And even if you achieve your goal weight or thinner body or kind of muscles, anyone who's walked this road will tell you hand on heart that it doesn't give them the magical fix to self-esteem that has been so longed for dearly. Once you achieve the initial goal, what tends to happen is the goalposts move and nothing feels good enough. You then feel like, well, I'm not as thin or lean as that person, or actually I still don't feel that I'm quite my best self yet. I need to lose a bit more or gain a bit more muscle, etc. So although this doesn't work as a lasting and soul-enriching strategy, it does offer, sadly, fleeting glimmers of self-worth, because in Western culture, weight loss tends to invite, oh wow, you've lost weight. It's a badge of honour. You're succeeding at something that few people can actually do. And if you're not feeling that great about yourself deep down, the initial compliments or attention can be really absorbed rapidly in a way that you kind of gulp water when you've been thirsty for hours in the desert. It can just feel like, oh my God, I'm finally kind of getting the validation I've always wanted. So some people, of course, are born in genetically smaller bodies, and I'd probably put myself in that category. We have thin privilege. Whereas some people are just naturally born in larger bodies and they don't have that thin privilege. And this makes this whole issue as well so much harder because of there's so much pressure to bear from society. And if you're in a larger body, you're already made to feel like, well, you just haven't got enough willpower. If you just kind of dieted a bit harder and exercised a bit more, then you would look as you should, etc. And it is just not true. So when people lose weight, interestingly, the attention and the comments often become unwanted as well quite quickly. And because I think perhaps initially there's that kind of sort of external validation, it can feel really good, but then often people start to feel the kind of disconnect. They're losing more weight, they're not feeling good, and they're so preoccupied with negative thoughts, low self-esteem, feeling they're not thin enough. It just feels like any comments then from outside actually provoke even more shame and guilt, and it just becomes this horrible spiral downwards. So to begin to change this, we need to move beyond valuing ourselves so much for how we look around our weight and shape, and we need to get more in touch with our deeper values and find ways of fulfilling our values to generate more productive and sustainable worth. So I'm just going to talk about a fictional client called Abby. So Abby had always felt unattractive as a child and relentlessly compared herself to her siblings, who she described as pretty and attractive. Now, one of Abby's sisters was academic and the other one was a dancer. And Abby felt that she had nothing in comparison. She didn't have like this special thing that her sisters had. And Abby felt that these messages had been constantly reinforced as she was growing up, with other people commenting about her siblings in a positive manner. So Abby started to feel unattractive and worthless, and she decided to go on a diet, and she initially quickly lost weight. And she felt amazing and a sense of power and control, and she felt she'd finally found something she was good at. Finally she could do something that made her stand out separately from her sisters. And Abby became addicted almost to the feelings of accomplishment, of the kind of the number on the scales going down, and she didn't want to give this up anytime soon. But very soon and quickly, she became caught in a relentless cycle of punishing, dieting, and relentless binge eating and purging. And she was constantly chasing that initial high that she had felt when she first lost weight and the feelings of achievement this had brought. So in therapy, Abby began to talk about her early life and to talk about these deeper feelings. And it was a painful process to talk about her feelings of unworthiness and hopelessness. But in time, Abby realised that there were things that she was good at as well. She was really into the arts, she was very creative, and she was also very caring. And these qualities just hadn't been appreciated or valued in her particular family growing up. And I think as well sometimes this is no one's fault necessarily, but I think certain families have certain values, and in certain families maybe like being scientific is really valued or good at maths or something. And if you're more creative or arty, maybe those things aren't valued as much, and it could be the other way around. So Abby began to learn to accept her qualities and value her innate uniqueness. And maybe she wasn't beautiful like a supermodel or getting grade A's in maths and English, but she was very creative. She loved to read and draw, and she blossomed and started to acknowledge her own unique worth. And the pursuit of thin then began to lose its appeal because she started to get that sense of worth from something else, and also just to develop a much greater self-acceptance and self-love. Now, this is challenging work because in the culture we live in, we're so vulnerable to chasing external validation to feel good, and it can feel terrifying to let go of chasing a smaller body when this feels like the only one thing that is making us feel better. Once you recognise, though, this trap that you're in, you can begin to consider a different way of evaluating yourself. And this isn't going to be an overnight process by any means, but realising how much you are influenced by the opinions of others and diet culture itself is the beginning of a powerful change journey. And if an eating disorder has been around, it does start to feel like it's part of you. It's what you do. Perhaps it feels like your identity. And you might be scared of who you might be without the eating disorder. And you might be terrified of what will fill the void. But, I just say it's so worth it though. Long term, however thin or controlling of food or how many steps you do, it's never going to really make you feel fulfilled deep down. And it's going to prevent you from engaging with so many of your natural talents and loves and things that can really, really bring you joy. I know for myself as well, it took me a long time to really work on the identity piece because I was such a profound people pleaser. I just outsourced my worth to everyone else, and I just did not know who I was. I could not make a decision. If I was asked to where I wanted to go for dinner or what was my favourite shop or what colour did I like, I wouldn't have a clue. I would just kind of tell the person what I thought they wanted to hear. And this wasn't through being manipulative. It was literally a survival strategy, like complete kind of fear of rejection. So when I was in the depths of my eating disorder as well, my value was so based on how thin I was, how much exercise I did, what other people thought of me, particularly in romantic relationships. I felt as well that I needed to be good at maths and science, as these were subjects that people in my life valued. I felt I needed to follow the agenda of others and say yes to whatever was asked of me, never mind if it was something I didn't like or was against my values. I was the biggest people pleaser. I didn't appreciate my qualities, the qualities I had of things like building relationships, empathy, connecting with others, or being able to create or write. I focused on everything I was not and compared myself relentlessly with others rather than getting in my own lane and appreciating my own unique qualities and strengths. But I'm very pleased to say, many years into recovery, I do not feel like this today, and I genuinely feel I have a very deeply fulfilling life. Okay, I still feel negative emotions, I still have struggles, I still have the ups and downs that any life will have, but ultimately I feel in a fulfilled place, I feel at peace, I have found self-love. So the first step in healing here is to really recognise how the eating disorder is serving you, albeit maladaptively, and begin to think about how you might achieve these goals through other more sustainable and healthy means. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the third mindset shift, and this is beginning to reject diet culture. Okay, so this follows a lot on from the last point, but we're going to go into it in an even deeper dive. So, as we've been talking about, diet culture, it values losing weight, a slim body shape, body aesthetics over well-being and health. So weight loss is praised regardless of the road taken to achieve this, and never mind if you end up getting an eating disorder. I know so many of my clients have talked about getting the most praise and validation that they've ever had in their life when they were at their most sick. It just shows how toxic the culture is. So diet mentality as well is firmly ingrained in our culture. It's almost seen as normal. I think it's particularly kind of like older generations, and I'll include myself in that, it's often not even being questioned. It's a given that Disney princesses are thin, people in the media tend to be in smaller bodies, and that diet plans are sold prolifically by multinational companies. All of this is just seen as normal. So questioning diet mentality may feel like an extraordinarily momentous task to begin with. As from the day you were born, you've been inundated with messages about how your body should look. In media and films, television, certain body types are represented far more often than others. There is so much pressure for women to be slim, small, lean, take up as little space as possible, whilst for men to be sort of muscular and to kind of, look a certain way. And there's a powerful subconscious message that losing weight is good, with diets and wellness plans becoming a normal part of life. So it can feel like that you're overhauling a whole belief system that has structured your whole way of thinking and living for most of your life. So when you start to think about challenging diet culture, it can feel impossible, challenging, terrifying to question all these effed up messages. It's a bit like kind of having to change your religion, nothing against religion here, but if you had been like a devout Christian maybe for many years, and for whatever reason you decided that you were going to become a Buddhist or an atheist, you couldn't just suddenly get rid of all the old belief system just out of your head. There's no way of just kind of whitewashing it. All of those kind of thoughts and beliefs have grown over time. Okay, so it's quite a big task to start to think about things differently. Now, thankfully, there is a powerful pushback against these old ideals, and people are challenging messages. The body positive movement, body neutrality. We know that actually things are starting to shift bit by bit. And we know as well that trying to force your body to conform to a certain shape which does not fit with your build or genetics and then involves eating in a way that disrupts your relationship with food is absolutely detrimental to mental and physical well-being. And this is often where eating disorders then develop. Because when you're so focused on achieving a certain aesthetic with your body and losing weight, which is perhaps going against your genetics and your natural hunger, etc., you're going to be restricting your food, and this is going to very, very likely lead to disordered eating behaviours. Because we know that when people restrict, we know from the Minnesota starvation study, you get powerful urges to eat. You have an excessive preoccupation with food. You have feelings of being out of control around food. You're focused a lot more on your body, and you have a loss of recognition of your internal hunger cues. You kind of lose that whole kind of reference point and self-trust with the body. And when we're so focused on weight and shape, we end up dieting. We end up then often falling into binge eating, disordered eating behaviours, purging, over exercising, etc. And then when we fall into these other behaviours, we think, well, the only way to solve this is to restrict myself further, and it just often makes things worse. Dietary restraint it is the problem, not the solution. Dietary restraint often leads to binges, uncontrolled eating, chewing and spitting, all these things, and it leads to this real preoccupation and fear around food. So, and when you primarily as well focus on your body as a way to achieve your self-worth, it's really, really, really hard to win. Because for a human being, your ability to follow a diet for the long term or achieve a certain number on the scale sustainably, it's really quite hard because our bodies are kind of fluctuating things. And also all our thoughts and feelings and behaviours then become so focused on achieving this that we tend to kind of then not be focusing on everything else that is going on in the world. Our self-worth has become so linked to maybe being a certain number on the scales or following a certain food plan. We've kind of lost sight really of our relationships, our hobbies, our work, all the other things that are important. So have a think for you, if you were like drawing out your self-worth pie chart with different segments, how much of that self-worth pie chart would be filled up with thoughts around weight, control of food, etc., and how much would be about other areas of your life, things like work or study or relationships or friendships or, romance or spirituality or hobbies. And when you kind of like draw out this pie chart and look at, kind of how much of your worth is connected to your weight and shape, etc., just have a look at it and think, is this really in line with my values and what's important to me? Because often, I think when we think about letting go of an eating disorder, it can feel terrifying. It can feel terrifying when we're thinking about the next meal or next week or whatever. But when we start to think about, actually, if I live with this for another 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, and then I'm going to be at the stage one day when I look back on my life, am I going to have lived a life that's in alignment with my values? Or am I going to have just been so focused on something that deep down was not really, really important to me? So again, this is not an exercise to beat yourself up, but it's an exercise to do like a zoom out, have a different relationship with your eating disorder, to notice maybe how distorted your thinking has become and how much you're focusing on weight and shape as a means of evaluating your worth, and also recognizing how difficult that is to achieve. It's really, really hard to feel good enough when your worth is dictated by something like that. And just imagine as well if you were kind of like evaluating your worth by, I don't know, how quickly your hair was growing or something, or looking at the size of your feet or something. When we sort of look at it from talking about other different sort of parts of our life, or other sort of different things related to appearance, it can always seem a bit ridiculous, like, my goodness, why am I just focusing on these things so much? But we need to be so compassionate with ourselves, because diet culture is so influential. And but even just by starting to question diet culture, to realize, oh my goodness, I'm so influenced by all these messages, and actually these messages are not really in line with my values. What are my values? How do I want to be living my life? What do I want my pie chart to be looking like? How do I want to be kind of getting lots of worth from all the different areas? It puts us in a much more profound place to be able to experience change. And I think as well, often we can think about when you're in that place of ambivalence with an eating disorder, all you can think about is, the loss of an eating disorder, it's going to be, a loss of so many things, like the loss of control, the loss of a sense of achievement, all these things. But actually, you could gain so much from not having your eating disorder. You could gain many wonderful experiences, like traveling, maybe, real connections with people, personal growth, getting the real sort of juice out of life. And it might also mean that some acceptance of your body is going to be needed to not conform to these crazy ideals. Maybe you can still value health and self-care, but you may need to let go of unrealistic goals, which could be keeping your body in a difficult and non-sustainable place. Because if you're trying to force your body to be in an underweight place for you, it's going to be really, really, really hard to sustain that for the long term, and you're going to be so likely to fall into disordered eating behaviours. So think for you personally, what is keeping you very much stuck in diet culture at the moment? Because when we are so immersed in diet culture, rejecting dieting is hard, and it might almost feel as though you're changing religion that you've adhered to so closely to for so many years. You might feel as though you've lost your purpose, your structure, and your meaning. It's very sad, isn't it? I think sometimes when we wake up and think, actually, gosh, so much of my purpose and sense of achievement comes from controlling my body. But actually, once we realise that, we can realise, actually, I don't want to play that game anymore. So you're going to be exposed to numerous diet culture triggers every day, but you can start to have some power over changing this and starting to kind of create an environment that is more positive and helpful for you. So think about as well, are there people at work or in your life that are always talking about their diets, and actually you get drawn into those conversations? Do you scroll social media and look at people who are very much immersed in diet culture and get very triggered by them and want to sort of pursue the kind of thin ideal? Are you looking at eating disorder accounts, actually, where people are clearly struggling and that is really triggering for you? Are you kind of reading books or absorbing like blogs or articles or content that are very diet focused? Are you watching a lot of TV programs that promote weight loss, promote, or kind of YouTube videos like what I eat in a day? All that stuff can like add fuel to the fire. So really notice kind of where in your environment can you start to put some boundaries in place and protect yourself. Because to reject diet mentality, we really need to start cutting out some of these things, or at least reducing them as a first step. And you might need to be absolutely ruthless, because once you have awareness of diet culture, you'll probably notice it popping up everywhere. And I think with this as well, the thing about being ruthless is that, say, even if you've still got like a couple of people you follow on Instagram or TikTok who are quite diet culture promoting, even if you spend 10 minutes of your day looking at those accounts, the powerful ripple effect on your thoughts and feelings is going to be quite profound. So you need to be really, really ruthless and start to protect yourself. Okay, so I hope this has been a helpful episode all around mindset. So there'll be more to come on this later this week. So from today, really reflect on understanding your past and what has led you to this point today. Exploring your understandable ambivalence around change, as the ED is a coping strategy. However, you can learn to cope with life in far healthier ways than with an eating disorder. And the third one is rejecting diet culture and getting fully in your recovery lane. Okay, hope you enjoyed this episode. If you're not following me already, do seek me out on Instagram at the eating disorder therapist _. And for further support with your relationship with food, do go to the eatingdisordertherapist.co.uk. If you enjoy this podcast, I'll be so grateful if you'd follow, rate and review, as it helps it reach so many more listeners. And if you're a professional listening to this, I now have my eating disorders professionals training day available online. The link is in the show notes. So if you are a personal trainer, a therapist, a counsellor, a coach, and you are working in eating disorders, but you're quite kind of new to this whole area, but you're noticing that some of your clients have eating disorders, have disordered eating, this can be a great introductory course for you. Okay, thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to sharing another podcast episode with you very soon.